We often think of human future in space to be multicultural and multi-ethnic. Some of these visions have been shaped by science fiction like that of Star Trek. However, not everyone imagines the future like this. For example, the alt right thinks about the future in space and space exploration itself, primarily the domain of white race. In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we have a conversation with Dr. Jordan Carroll, who is the author of Speculative Whiteness, Science Fiction, and the Alt-Right. Hello and welcome to Chai on the Moon, where we talk about societal and ethical issues related to human settlements in space, in particular on the moon. Our guest today is Dr. Jordan Carroll, and it is my honor and pleasure to have a conversation with him. He received his PhD from the University of California, Davis. He is the assistant editor at Los Angeles Review of Books. His first book, Reading the Obscene, Transgressive Editors and the Class Politics of U.S. Literature, won the MLA Prize for Independent Scholars. His writing has appeared in American Literature, Post 45, The Nation, Polygon, Jacobin, and, of course, the Los Angeles Review of Books. His most recent book, part of the reason why we are having a conversation, is called Speculative Whiteness, Science Fiction, and the Alt-Right, and it just got published in 2024. Dr. Carroll, welcome. So, and I think we were just talking right before starting here. Absolutely. I breezed through this book. There's a lot of course, I love science fiction. So there's a lot of science fiction component to that. And it's a fascinating book. And there are a lot of things to talk about. And before we even start, I just want to mention that because we talk about on Chai on the Moon on this series, more about settlements on the moon or space exploration. And while reading your book, I was actually surprised how many times space or space exploration was brought up within the alt right narrative. And so and we are also recording in the third week of Trump presidency. So I just want to give sort of like, the timeline in there where I think your book has become even more relevant now. But let's start with the news story that came out from last week, and that was that NASA's DEI office, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and actually it was DEIA initiative over there, accessibility as well, that was shut down pretty much. The website is gone. They have even, it's unclear whether how much is it directly from official directive or people already taking decisions regarding that. But there was an article that was mentioned in 2023, the article about the class of astronauts from 1978, which included the first woman, first African American astronauts, and that article is no longer on the NASA website. So I'm just curious, first of all, just what is your take on that? And in the light of your book, in which one of the things that you talk about is that, like, that space exploration itself sometimes is portrayed as that it can only be done or it should be done by only white folks. So unpack a little. I mean, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you right at the beginning, but can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we were saying earlier, like this felt like such like an esoteric topic. Like, what do white supremacists think about NASA? Like, why would that be relevant? And then the last few weeks happened. I mean, we've seen, in some ways, I think with Trump, a contradiction. In his inaugural address, he came out and suggested, and we might want to unpack this phrase in a moment, that the U.S. has a manifest destiny to plant a flag on Mars. So we have these like giant ambitions for what a Trump administration is going to do or try to do surrounding space flight and space exploration. And yet, in the past week or two, and it's always worth saying, like, things are so fluid right now. Like, I don't want to make too many um, firm statements about what's going to happen, but we've seen the NASA website being scrubbed of references to, yeah, as you said, DEI, indigenous people, women in leadership. We're seeing NASA employees being told to remove their pronouns from their email signatures. We're seeing the pride flag being removed not only from the NASA website, but from offices at NASA, according to some reports. And people saying, or not people, but the administration telling NASA to stop funding gender ideology. And these seem like all very odd things to do. Like, if your goal is to travel to Mars, why is the Trump administration obsessing over the web presence of NASA and down to the email signatures of specific employees? Um, but I think that these are actually intimately related. I think that this is rooted in an alt right ideology that suggests that NASA's real or imagined problems are come down to DEI, and there's a long-standing narrative on the far right that there used to be this great era during the Apollo programs and in the lunar landing of an all-white or nearly all-white NASA, and that achievement was rooted in whiteness, white innate intelligence, as well as supposedly white innate risk taking and willingness to take huge risks to achieve greatness. And so we often see people on the far right blaming the efforts to diversify NASA in the 1970s for NASA's perceived decline. And I should note too that, like, the absence of crewed missions to the moon and elsewhere has become a deep source of national shame for some on the far right, a sign of America's lost greatness, and really the world's lost greatness in their eyes. But they suggest that it's comes down to things like Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek, her promotional efforts to bring in more women and people of color into NASA, and they suggest that NASA shifted its mission from achievements in spaceflight to essentially what is now called DEI. There are other kinds of aspects of this narrative too that come down to an anti-welfare state politics, a suggestion that NASA is not getting enough funding because we are funding welfare recipients, which is obviously presented in a very racialized way as well. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that part of what we're seeing with the Trump administration is an attempt to create an image, and maybe eventually we see so many calls for resignations right now, an actuality of a NASA that is increasingly male and increasingly white dominated as a way of achieving spaceflight, which, as you say, is as presented as this sort of inherently white desire and an inherently white achievement on the far right.
And just as a clarification for people who are watching it, like, that in actuality or in
Yeah,
reality,
yeah,
the presence of non-white astronauts doesn't mean that they are not qualified, because as there are thousands of applicants. Out of those, sort of like, you pick like 10 or 20. So that is not the issue, but it is about the perspective, like, the way they see that in the 60s it was all white.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
so,
yeah, and it's also worth pointing out, as films and well, as the film and book Hidden Figures point out, like, black mathematicians were central to spaceflight as well, and so they kind of want to erase that history, and also I think exaggerate the degree of success in diversification at NASA. Like, they often present it as if suddenly it became the most representative institution circa 1978, and after that everything completely changed. But I think both of those narratives are false. It wasn't all white, and it also didn't suddenly become entirely representative of the population at some moment in the 1970s or 80s.
so can I pause you for a second, and ask you from definition perspective, because we have also used far right and alt right
Yeah.
and those type of things. How do you define? So for when we are having this conversation, alt right, far right, white supremacist. I mean, how do you define those things? Are there difference, or are there different words for the similar groupings?
I mean, I think that they're overlapping categories. I think in some ways the book is just about fascism or white nationalism, with alt right being a subset. So I guess I would say, when I say fascism, I would say a movement that is trying to overthrow, and I think, or I guess now we see dismantle the state in order to um, preserve or deepen perceived natural hierarchies, whether that be hierarchies of race or gender or religion or culture. And the alt right is one example of a fascist movement. Their goal is to remake the state and remake society, but they have a specific set of strategies that they think are going to achieve that goal. And you know, I'm still uncertain about like this current status of the alt right at this point. I thought that they had maybe passed away into something else, but we're seeing a resurgence of them in other ways. But I think, at least at the moment I'm looking at in the book, they imagine that change would occur through culture, essentially, and through a kind of mainstreaming of fascist attitudes by looking at popular culture and doing interpretations of popular culture and subtly undermining liberalism, egalitarianism, and multiculturalism through these kinds of counter messages that they were going to generate. Obviously, that's not the entirety of what's associated with the alt right. There are plenty, I think, of people on the alt right who turned in a very much more violent direction, using terrorism in order to achieve their goals. And I should also add, like, you know, this is not a movement that whose ultimate goals won't be violent. It's a movement dedicated towards genocide and extermination and domination as well. But I think that's kind of the terrain, a broader coalition of fascists that are devoted to preserving and deepening hierarchy, even at the cost of overthrowing the state, and a smaller tendency within that that is sometimes present and sometimes not, that sees that as achievable at first through a kind of ideological persuasion or ideological subversion through culture like science fiction.
So this is interesting. You also mentioned sort of like the cultural component to that, and I'm going to come back to it in 1 second, about sort of like why focus on space or science fiction.
Mhm.
But something else that is on my mind, and we are talking about what is going on right now with the DEI, sort of like, blaming on the DEI
Mhm.
and diversity and multiculturalism to various types of things, and those are being purged right now under Trump's second term, and also with the help of Elon Musk. Of course, we are
Mhm.
going to talk about Elon Musk because I think that's a key figure right now in it. But you mentioned in your book at one point, and another key figure in the alt right, Richard Spencer
Mhm.
and Greg Johnson, their work, and I don't know if it was a direct quote, or you were referring to their work as that space exploration will be an elite endeavor organized by an authoritarian dictatorship and funded thanks to the austerity program, or it will not happen at all.
Mhm.
To me, I mean, when this thing started and the way Elon Musk also frames his mission to Mars, for example, I mean, sometimes people think, well, I mean, he wants to go, no, but he justifies it as saving humanity. So there is this element that, okay, well, if the logic would go, if we have to save humanity, then if we have to make some sacrifices, for example, like, leaving people in poverty or whatever it takes, even probably including killing people if it has to, but if
Mhm.
there's a greater good to it, right,
Yeah.
like, of saving humanity. And to me, I mean, again, when this started happen, when Elon Musk became in charge and he started cutting down through Doge all these government
Mhm.
infrastructure, I mean, to me, this struck me because to a certain degree, that is what was being stated, that that would be the way to go, of extreme austerity measure in order to preserve the space program. And if the space program is measured for white people, so is that sort of like, within the realm of thinking about it? Is somebody thinking about it, or is Doge separate, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I think you're right. It does seem related. I mean, it's the part of it is this idea that the reason we haven't had greater technological progress, including space exploration, is um, like a focus on handouts, but also more broadly a focus on short-term gratifications. And the argument that the far right often makes is that the masses, if this includes a lot of people outside of the elite, but especially non-white people. Um, if given their choice, they're going to pick short-term diversions, immediate gratification, more stuff, and they're not going to make the hard sacrifices required to go into space or to achieve greatness. And the argument then is that some kind of dictatorial force has to um, ignore the democratic demand for a livable life in the here and now, and instead, impose austerity, impose sacrifice, and create a longer term program that ends in colonizing space. And either that will mean the elites go off into space and leave the masses behind, or maybe we'll all somehow benefit from this program of space colonization, depending on who the speaker is and what their attitude is at that moment. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that there is I think a deep connection between this idea that there's something about democracy and the welfare state that are antithetical to techno-scientific discovery and innovation, including spaceflight.
I mean, and that would make the threat in terms of the diversity and the welfare state and
Yeah.
and democracy in general, because that's a slower process. I mean, so that's where, I mean, in some sense, within their worldview, I mean, I think that would make sense within it. I'm curious why space, uh, and I mean science fiction in particular, but that's also related to space. So space exploration, why is that a topic of interest to the alt right or
Mhm.
the far right?
I mean, I think for a number of reasons. I mean, it does have great propaganda value for them. It presents a kind of exciting image for science fiction fans. But I also think it does a lot of ideological work for them. There's a great book called Astrofuturism by DeWitt Douglas Kilgore, and he argues that space has often served, particularly in the US consciousness, as a place where racial tensions and conflicts get resolved. We have different versions of this, but it's one is Star Trek, and we can talk about how much the alt right hates Star Trek. But the idea that humanity goes out into space and they meet people who have blue skin and antennae or whatever, and they learn to tolerate and include everybody ultimately, and that also trickles down to a united humanity as well. Or the narrative of looking back at the pale blue dot and realizing how fragile and small Earth is, and we're all in it together, is another version of this. Or in maybe more sinister versions, there's a militaristic version of this where humanity goes into space and meets the bug-eyed monsters and fights them and realizes that we all have to unite. Ronald Reagan would often sort of give a speech where he'd say, if the aliens came down, the Soviets and the US would come together against the shared threat of the other instead of othering each other, essentially. But for the alt right, like space becomes a way of solving racial problems because it's a place where there are no non-white people. I think that they're really drawn to the idea of colonization and a new frontier, but they don't want to colonize places where there's an indigenous non-white population that they might mix with. So space becomes a way of imagining, as the Nazis would put it, a Lebensraum, a living space for white people that they can go and have a kind of racially pure society. That's one version of this. Another is that space exploration itself has a eugenic effect. They think that only the best and the brightest, the people with the right stuff, are going to be picked to go out into space, and then everybody else will be left who are unfit on Earth. And as a result, we'll see the emergence of an elite, maybe even post-human version of humanity in space that's better than everyone else, because only people with advanced degrees who are healthy are going to get picked to go out into space. Um, the other thing that they're interested in is like this idea of, like, again, the frontier, which always in the US imagination has been this place where civilized men can prove themselves to be tough and to overcome adversity, and in the process overcome the feminizing effects of civilization or the weakening effects of civilization. And so Richard Spencer imagines that the kind of couch potato science fiction fan can, once given the mission to go into space, can rise up and become more manly because they're facing the prospect of death, they're facing all the difficulties of space, and they're going to rise to the challenge, even if it means they kill them, if they kill, even if it means they die in the process. That this is somehow going to improve the spirit of white people. So it does a lot of different work for them, as well as, again, like just providing the image of like, what is it that they offer as a utopia? And obviously we don't think of it as utopia, but what is the new thing that they're going to give us? They're in some ways a revolutionary movement, or at least an insurrectionary movement, and they have to provide, like, here's the next thing. It's not just going to be business as usual. It will be all white colonies on other planets, and that's their fantasy essentially.
That's really interesting, and that's where I mean, I guess the cultural element brings you to science fiction within that same thing. Um, I'm curious. I mean, of course, Elon Musk's name has already been mentioned, and who's, I mean, from the Silicon Valley perspective, he is one of the, if not the most prominent name. Do you see others in the space sector that follow this realm of thinking? I mean, it's unclear. I mean, with Elon Musk, I know that he has mentioned a little bit about eugenics or eugenics light
Yeah.
claims. I mean, he has said, like, that people who are smart, that they should have babies and not the ones who are not smart. So, like, and he himself, in fact, one of his kids is sort of like, rationalized regard like that. I'm curious, in your work, have you encountered uh, people in the Silicon Valley who adhere to this philosophy more explicitly, this line of reasoning?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways in Silicon Valley it takes on a different emphasis and valence. I mean, I think there's one version of fascism which is very much about like blood and soil, racial purity, and community. Um, but in Silicon Valley, it seems to take on a different form, what I kind of imagine or describe as like a eugenic meritocracy that is a little less interested in racial purity. I mean, we saw this with like the visa controversy, for example, but nevertheless believes that there are some people who are forward looking and smart and high IQ and innately so. And then there are others that don't fit into this and need to be kept away from power and disempowered, if not someday eliminated, it seems like. For Musk, I mean, it's hard to always to read what he actually thinks because he has kind of such a scattershot way of presenting things. I mean, he philosophizes with tweets rather than manifestos. But I mean, I think Musk is very much invested in this idea, and one that we find in things like Asimov's Foundation series or Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, that history is made by the smart few rather than the broader masses. And he believes that, I think he is at the head of that, and that he is going to determine the destiny of humanity. And I think that he wants others to kind of be silent and go along for the ride and follow his plan of maximizing the population of genetically gifted people. And part of what the reason he wants space is he thinks that this will be, more room for thousands upon millions upon billions upon trillions of smart people filling the galaxy, and that's going to accelerate technological progress to some unbelievable degree. At least I think that's probably what his fantasy is. But again, like, he's so, I don't know, like he's so all over the place that it's sometimes hard to get into his head.
I mean, That's where, I mean, perhaps the division between within the MAGA movement here in the
Mhm.
US lies as well about the H-1B controversy.
Mhm.
But just last week, and probably by the time we finish this conversation, the person who's been one of the young people who are going through the Treasury Department, who resigned because of his racist tweets, and one of his tweets was he wanted to normalize Indian hate.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so,
Mhm.
although a lot of people have come in defense, including Musk and Speaker Johnson and so on and so forth. So he may get, but that's where it looks like. I mean, that's where a bit of a tension, pure, like, where the brown people are allowed, brown, black, versus they are not allowed at all. And I think Steve Bannon would be. I mean, I don't know where Steve Bannon comes in, because he also takes an
Yeah.
interesting take of his white nationalism. Also has an anti-capitalist to a certain degree, but still a
Mhm.
white nationalist. So I think that's where, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you're right. There's a tension there, but at the same time, I mean, I think part of the hallmark of somebody who's on the far right is their willingness to spend time and even defend somebody like that. Like
Yeah.
there are these different tendencies. Some are willing to admit some racial populations into the fold, and some are very much like, we are only interested in white Europeans. But they're all in the same swamp, and they all don't see some level of racism as disqualifying to for somebody. I think.
So this is a good time to again to remind people, like, that your book is Speculative Whiteness, Science Fiction and the Alt-Right. So can you define speculative whiteness, which you do in the books? I mean, I just want for readers, for listeners to also, if you can define that. What is speculative whiteness? How do you define that?
It means a couple of things. One is the idea that only white people, and usually this is white men, have the capacity for speculative imagination. That only white men can envision the future, so they can see it, but also that they have the discipline to bring that future about. We see this a lot on the far right, attributing all manner of innovations and inventions to white people and claiming that that is somehow part of the white birthright, essentially. It's also an ideology that suggests that um, whiteness can only fulfill its potential in a techno fascist future. So they imagine that the future, if it's anything other than disaster and regression into a kind of archaic past, is going to be all white, essentially. But the other component of it is just this idea that whiteness isn't something actual; it's something that is potential. It's something that is a destiny or a possibility that only white people have. And this is obviously very consoling to many on the alt right who don't really have many accomplishments to their name. So they can imagine that there's some fascist world in which they'd be doing great things if only they were allowed to fulfill this um, biological or genetic or spiritual potential that they have. And all of these different aspects kind of come together in the way that the alt right has been interested in science fiction. And really, fascists and white nationalists um, for many decades have been interested in science fiction. And so often we see the alt right, in particular, performing reviews and critiques of science fictional texts, in some cases, creating science fictional texts as a way to show what their future would be and how they imagine things would happen after the genocide, essentially. But I go further back to look at the ways that neo Nazis and white nationalists in the 20th century as well were really interested in science fiction imagery and science fiction texts as well.
And you mentioned, so just to take one example, because in the film form it was more recently. Of course, the book is
Mhm.
fantastic, Dune,
Yeah,
Frank
yeah.
Herbert's Dune, and that is a critique of sort of like, some of the things that white nationalists are planning, or fascism and things like that.
Mhm.
Can you say a few words how sort of like, how does the alt-right see, or what is their reading of Frank Herbert's Dune?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the insidious things about the alt right is they are often um, really biased readers of science fiction. They will frequently take a text that is about warning against fascism, or at least it contains that as a dominant reading, and then they will subvert that and say, no, actually, this is endorsing fascism, because whenever you critique something or whenever you condemn something, you have to also describe it and depict it in some way. So I think that what they do with something like Dune is look at Paul Atreides, who is in the text kind of destined to become this emperor of the galaxy, essentially, and is this almost superhuman figure who can predict the future. And in the book, or in the series, I guess I should say, in later books, it's revealed how disastrous in some ways this is. Like, it results in the death of billions. It results in a kind of totalitarian government that um, controls everything. And one of the things that we're supposed to learn from the series, and different readers have argued about how successful this is that we need to stop trusting in Superman, essentially, to save us. That we can't imagine that the all powerful dictator who is uniquely capable is going to swoop in and solve all of our problems. But for the far right, they see a figure like Paul Atreides and they're like, no, this is what we want. And in particular, they're interested in the fact that his ability is, he's not like a superhero with super strength or anything. His ability is that he can see possibilities, due in part to his genetic gifts, but also due to the drug that he takes in the series. And so they want a leader who's capable of looking into the far future and resisting the temptations of the present, and putting in place this plan of action that's going to realize something great, in spite of the fact that it might be painful, and even murderous in the short term. This is what they want, essentially, and I think, as we talked about earlier, like, this is what they think has to happen for space exploration, to ignore the needs of people on Earth and ignore these pressing demands that people have in order to build something that will last millennia, essentially.
And if I remember correctly, I mean, even Frank Herbert himself also struggled with that and responded to that, because the first book
Yeah,
uh, was kind of like the heroic element was pretty strong and the critique element was a little subtle. I mean, I think it is there.
yeah,
I should mention that when I read it, I read it back. I was in Pakistan at the time, and I think after high school, and I remember reading it, loved the book. I mean, there is a lot
yeah,
of
yeah,
course, Arabic references, Middle Eastern references in there, and so there was some familiarity to it. But so you're rooting for it. I remember sort of like,
yeah.
digging into it, and then towards the end, I was like, huh, I'm a little, uncomfortable with that. Like, but it wasn't like,
Mhm.
it wasn't as, I have to say, even reading from me, like, I wasn't as clear about the problems. It was more like, and I think that's probably when the first book, that's what Frank Herbert wanted you to feel in the tease, uncomfortable
Mhm.
without spelling it out. And so, like, so after high
Yeah.
school, I'm reading it and I was like, oh, that's a little, the ending is a little weird for me. Like, it's like, but I thought I was rooting for him, but that's not, I mean, he just goes back and he says, "Hey, I'm just taking my identity, like, in my house." And so, House of Atreides. But then he cleared out in the
Mhm.
second part. I mean, he was much more clearer about, no, 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 he is a problem for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think these texts have to make us feel ambivalent. Like, it wouldn't be an effective
Yeah.
critique of fascism in science fiction if it didn't sort of evoke those feelings, of being excited by the Ubermensch who rises above all the odds and all the difficulties and changes the world. I think we're supposed to, like, first have that moment of investment, and then step back and be like, oh wait, I mean, we see this in a lot of things, whether that be Watchmen or Starship Troopers or Norman Spinrad's The Iron
Right.
Dream, of like um, eliciting the investment in the dominating hero, and then being like, wait, we need to step back and critique that and realize that that's embedded in science fiction as a genre, and therefore we need to wrestle with it in order to remove it ultimately.
But there are also science fiction authors, or authors, I mean, like Ayn Rand, but also science fiction
Mhm.
authors who are a bit more inclined towards fascism, or sort of like in there.
Mhm.
So, I mean, can you give one or two examples, just to contrast that with people who are critiquing it versus people who kind of like are okay with that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we see. I mean, I'm always reluctant to
Right, right.
name somebody as a
Yeah, yeah.
fascist who has not explicitly endorsed fascism. But I mean, I think we see fascist tendencies in books like Heinlein's Farnham's
Right.
Freehold, which features an all-black society that is trapped in a technological and social stagnation, and only can innovate because of the efforts of essentially enslaved white people. I mean, I think we see in a book like that the kind of logic of the far right. Heinlein is somebody who's kind of ideologically seems to shift from book to book. But at least in that text, I feel like it's embodying a lot of what the far right believes. Ayn Rand, yeah, as you point out, I think also is invested in this idea that the great hero who sees into the future and is kept from achieving that future by the masses, who are often presented as in using racialized imagery. Um, and in science fiction fandom as well, I look at figures like James H. Madel, who is the first um, major neo-Nazi leader in the United States, but he comes out of fandom. And so one of the arguments of the book is that we tend to think of science fiction as Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin. We tend to think of science fiction as somehow inherently progressive. But there's also been another side to science fiction, and fascists have always been in the science fiction community. They're not outside agitators who have shown up since the emergence of the internet or anything like that. This has been one side of that battle for what science fiction means, probably since science fiction's inception.
And something that you had teased earlier on, about Star Trek, for example. I mean, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that would be a great place for of battle, because Gene Roddenberry explicitly designed Star Trek uh, in order to confront some of these racial issues of the 1960s, and so putting them in space. So how do some of these people think in terms of Star Trek and the future it envisions? Because that's also set in the future. That is a vision of future, and that is also utopian. That was Gene Roddenberry's vision.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised at the vehemence with which the alt right hates Star Trek. I mean, often people will critique Star Trek for not going far enough, but really, I think that the far right sees it as a threat, because it does have a vision of multiculturalism and tolerance and inclusion, but also egalitarianism in space. Like, it is a world in which the market doesn't govern everything that they do on the Starship Enterprise. They have abundance, and they don't have to worry about those kinds of economic scarcities anymore. And so, people like Richard Spencer have written and spoken about their distaste for Star Trek, um, because it suggests that space travel is something that not only aliens with pointy ears are going to be involved in, but also humans from every kind of racial, ethnic, and cultural background. And so they really do want to claim the future as their own, and in particular claim the future of spaceflight as their own. and the someone like Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek is a threat to that. A black woman on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise is is frightening to them, I think. And the only moments that they enjoy in Star Trek are moments in which that the specter of fascism emerges, like the Khan episode of the original series of Star Trek. They Spencer in particular identifies with the figure of Khan as the Ubermensch, the superhuman figure who is presented as completely counter to the science fiction vision that um, the Federation represents in that world. He's not interested in working with others. He's not interested in building a better future for everybody. He's only interested in demonstrating his own superiority over everybody else.
Although Khan probably is from Central Asia or something like that, but they may trace
Yeah.
it to Aryans or whatever, like, but yeah, but I mean, but that is there. Uh, again, piggybacking on that a little bit, within that context, you also talk a little bit about archeofuturism, and that is associated with one of the figures that you mentioned in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because again, this is all embedded in it. Why a type of future is possible through white people, but that is related to this idea. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean it's a really contradictory notion, I think, and the far right loves contradictions and paradoxes in a lot of ways. I mean, they think that they can resolve any contradiction through the by imagining, well, it's embedded in race somehow. So archaeofuturism, and this comes out of the French New Right, and in particular the far right writer Guillaume Faye, is the idea of a future that combines archaic elements from the past, kind of traditional elements, with futuristic technologies. So, in his book on this, he imagines what is it, a Euro-Siberian Federation, I think is what he calls it, a kind of white empire that runs from Western Europe to, I think, the edge of Russia, if I remember correctly. And it's a world in which most people live in these agrarian villages, um, enjoying their traditional folk ways, but there's a small number of people who are capable of handling modernity, essentially, and they are the Faustian elite, he calls them, who are creating the technological changes that make this world dynamic and ever changing. But beyond this bizarre fascist utopia that he imagines, I think the central idea of this is that the future comes out of the past, that the future isn't novel, it isn't new. It's just an expression of a spirit or a genetic potential that's always existed. So the space flight is seen as um, part of that same desire to build and to create and surpass the present that was manifested in Europe in things like cathedrals. And so I think it's a way for the far right to, on one hand, lay claim to the future and lay claim to scientific uh, innovation and technological change, but arguing that it won't actually change anything. And that, I think, is part of the ways that the far right's attitude towards speculation and science fiction differs in a fundamental way from most science fiction fans. They can imagine the most radical things happening. They can imagine creating a Dyson sphere on the sun or creating a post-human species, but they believe that whiteness will always persist and always be the source of positive change and innovation in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so. I mean, I think all the contradictions, I mean, in some sense, don't matter because ultimately the basic assumption is about this supremacy of the whites. I mean, in that context, and so as long as that is there, it doesn't matter. And if I remember correctly, I mean that it also has the justification, historical justification that is given is also that because the Europeans were sort of like settled in harsher climates, or something like that. So they were more suitable for innovation and thinking imaginatively or long term planning compared to people who were not. And of course, that racially divides.
Yeah, and anthropologists have pointed out how ridiculous that
Right.
idea is. Like there are so many people who live in climates that are just as harsh as the Arctic North. Like the idea that there's something uniquely difficult about harsh winters. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Like, I often find as I look at these ideas, I start to be like, all right, well, here's the critique, and then it's like, well, it almost feels not like worth critiquing because it presents it as a rational argument, because they'll say, oh, it's cold winters, and then there'll be another one that's like, no, actually it's because of a some kind of spirit or culture. They often like give so many contradictory explanations for what is supposedly white greatness that it becomes clear that it's kind of it's a myth. It's a touchstone that they can point to justify a foregone conclusion. But yeah, part of that is this, and this is common, I think, in scientific racism. It goes back um, at least a century, probably more than a century. This, yeah, the idea that somehow the cold North fosters long-term thinking, having your storehouse of food, as well as technological innovation, where the shelters and clothing required to survive. But again, like there's no biome on the planet that doesn't involve that kind of like innovation and ingenuity, and there's no population on the planet that hasn't demonstrated its capacity to do those things. And so I think it is like a thing that they repeat again and again to reassure themselves of their basically their narcissism, their self love.
Yeah. Uh, okay. So one. So I want to end towards the future and about the moon itself. I mean, I'm gonna come moon and Mars. I'm gonna come back to it in 1 second. But I was fascinated. So I teach a class called Aliens: Close Encounters of Multidisciplinary Kind, and I have followed uh, the new UFOs have turned into UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, and now and in fact it's unidentified anomalous phenomena now. And I have followed, uh, partly with dismay, because I think it's actually, I feel that the way there is a small group of people who have also taken over. I mean, like, they have government hearings and all of that stuff, all spurred by a New York Times article and all of that stuff. And in your book, you actually mention that UFOs and aliens also intersect with the far right imagination as well. And I want to hear a little bit about that, because I have also encountered it when people talking about these UAPs. This type of narrative comes in, but again, because it is out of context. It's like, there's a civilizational warfare going on, or there are other things. When people make these kind of claims, it is not connected to the sort of like broader far right, for example, ideology. So can you say a little bit about what is the connection? How does it show up?
Yeah, and I think this demonstrates the ways that far right ideas can be passed off as something else because of these speculative imaginations. I think if somebody told us that that there's a war on Earth between the people who are Nordic, who are blonde haired and blue eyed, and this sort of subhuman race of schemers, I think we would immediately say that's fascist. But because it gets uh, transposed into the stars, people I think, are more willing to accept it. And there's a genealogy there of influence that starts with William Dudley Paley, who was the head of the fascist silver shirts in the 1930s. He is during the Second World War, is one of the people who's um, uh, comes under government suspicion. I think he ultimately goes to jail because the U.S. is fighting fascism, and they can't tolerate people supporting that in the United States. But he comes out of that at the end of that journey as a kind of new age thinker, and we see early, and at least one early ufologist like picking up his work and reading it and kind of internalizing it. And I think what we see is this vision of a superior race in the stars fighting an inferior race of kind of cerebral masterminds, which is sort of the ultimately, I think, part of the origin of the gray. Um, and that I think has a very anti-Semitic overtone to it. I mean, anytime you see a conspiracy theory about someone who is infiltrating and perverting society. We even see, the later versions of the gray aliens as somehow biologically contaminating humans. I do feel like it is a kind of transposition of fascist fantasies onto space. Obviously, there's more there. I mean, there are other tendencies within ufology, but it also seems like ufology often is reflecting the political worries and anxieties and fantasies that are happening at a given moment. There are also other kinds of um, far right ideas about and this is one thing where it was like I had to stop myself before I going too far down this rabbit hole. But the Nazis, with their rocketry program, going off into space instead of being defeated in the Second World War, and this idea that they're out there somewhere, it's Antarctica or the Hollow Earth or another dimension. Anything on the far right, this serves as a kind of myth that allows them to claim that their side wasn't defeated in that war and that they persist somewhere. And it's also, yeah, I mean, I think that we see this as well with somebody like Jason Reza Giorgiani, who started out on the alt right, but is now passing himself off as a new age thinker. So I think sometimes we see people go into these sort of paranormal fields as a way of laundering what are often bad ideas and disastrous political ideologies by kind of mystifying them with some of this imagery.
Yeah, Tom DeLonge, the lead singer of Blink 182, who actually went into ufology, or like he said, "I'm leaving the band in order to dedicate my life for UFOs," and he was actually one of the key figures regarding the big front page story in the New York Times that came out, I think, in 2017. So I tracked him quite closely regarding that, and he gave an interview in which I think on maybe on Joe Rogan, that was way back before Joe Rogan was that big, in which he had mentioned that, well, the Roswell crash, and again I will put it in quotes, like, the crash, that actually it wasn't alien. So this, again, talking about your contradictions, it can all feature in, because he had said actually that those were actually that was German technology, that like Nazi technology that had flown in, and that's what it had crashed. It wasn't alien. So anyway, it just all gets mixed in to
Yeah.
all of that. So it's really fascinating. But by now, some of the viewers must be thinking, well, wait a minute, but these conversations are about human settlements on the moon or social issues and other things. How did we get onto all of these other topics? And so let me reframe that, and then ask your opinion. Reframing is about, because as we are seeing space exploration and a lot of these things are connected potentially to this ideology, not everywhere, but we are talking about just in particular within the US context, and with Elon Musk, for example, as a really influential figure in the US government and in NASA, and of course his own SpaceX. So we are talking about these things within that context. So how do you see, and I know people are very, they're sort of like, they're shy in terms of predicting the future, but
Yeah.
how, the way things are going right now, so we are in 2025, early 2025, how do you see the future in space shaping up, and in particular with Musk and other space entrepreneurs coming up, and with this stuff around it, how do you see uh, space exploration
Yeah,
going?
and I feel like I should give the usual caveats. I'm in looking at the practicalities of space exploration. I'm obviously an amateur rather than an expert, but I do feel like that the idea that Musk presents of privatized space exploration is self defeating in some ways. Like I don't, and maybe people can correct me on this. I don't see um, space as providing immediate profit returns to each mission anytime soon. I think that if we are going to further explore other planets, it's going to be a publicly funded and ultimately altruistic effort. I think that we have to go into space thinking that this is intrinsically valuable for um, the scientific knowledge that we gain from it, and the shared sense of mission and purpose that it provides. I don't think that we're going to see people like Musk's sort of libertarian vision of space providing a kind of boom for investors, except insofar as administrations like Trump's might give Musk even more government contracts. I also, I'm really skeptical about the idea that space colonization or interplanetary colonization is going to provide the immediate escape hatch that people like Musk have seemed to hope for. I think that it's going to be a long time before we see a self-sustaining space colony, and so the idea that like we need the colonies to prevent existential risks seems dubious to me. I mean, if we had a space colony on Mars and something happened to Earth, and I imagine that very quickly that would be also a dead planet as well. Um, and so I really do think that on one hand we need to preserve public funding for spaceflight and other scientific endeavors, and I think this is something we should be particularly worried about, given the recent calls on the part of the Trump administration to gut the National Science Foundation. And we also need to worry about earthly concerns. I think that these should be two separate conversations. We need to continue exploring the stars, but we also need to deal with climate change, ecological collapse, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and we can't imagine that space flight is somehow going and space colonization is somehow going to like provide an out for those. We have to deal with those on their own terms, essentially. And I think that we have to see this as a shared future. I think the idea of the elite space program or like the all white space program is obviously erroneous. We have to get everybody invested in space flight. We need to reach out to people from all racial backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, all orientations. Reach out to women. Everybody should be, I think, involved in what is actually, I think, a planetary project of space exploration, and not just something that only the few are going to benefit from. And I think that there are not only principled reasons for that, but also practical reasons. If when we saw this in the 1960s, if people see that they are suffering here on Earth, and a small number of billionaires or maybe a government is pouring money into space travel, I mean, they're going to resent that. So I think we need to see this not as something that the privileged few get to direct and enjoy, but as a democratic project that everybody should be participating in.
But do you think? I mean, ideologically, I mean, in some sense, for some of the things that you have mentioned, can we see it going the other way? I mean, I know it's I mean, in some sense it's not practical, but on the other hand, if the diversity, if it does become a purge, which it looks like
Mm-hmm.
right now to a certain degree, I mean, I don't know to what extent it's going to be. I mean, this is, we are also within the US context, in an unprecedented times, right? So I mean, we don't
Yeah.
know to what level exclusion is going to happen, right? Do you see a place where the space program, for example, especially under Musk, right? I mean, if
Mhm.
SpaceX and Jared Isaacman, who's expected to take over NASA, do you see that that could get backing, for example, from more backing from the far right? I mean, in that sense, because it's not just the space program from that perspective, but it
Mhm.
is also theoretically it supports the ideological base of that. I mean, do you see that type of thing taking off, or do you think it's just too improbable to worry about that?
I mean, I think we see throughout Trump's reign in the first regime, or the first administration, the second administration, and interest in these big splashy announcements and projects that don't always go anywhere. I mean, who knows? I think at this point, but I mean, I think that if we see an interest in shrinking the government, and we're seeing um, these calls for mass resignation, and at the same time as cutting basic research, I'm just not convinced that NASA will be the one thing that they really want to expand. In part because I mean, Musk is in right now, but who knows? Like we thought that of Bannon too. So it's also possible that this lasts until Trump gets too mad that Musk is on Time Magazine. Um, I don't know. I mean, it seems like that Trump is so fickle and more interested in style than substance. He's very interested in changing the web presence of NASA, but he's yet to show a material commitment to expanding. I mean, maybe you can correct me, but expanding its budget significantly. And I think too, with a GOP dominated Congress right now, I don't know that that's going to a lot of movement is going to happen there, but maybe. Um, but at the same time, I think that projects like that will involve a long timeline, and I think if um, I think if Trump gets everything that he wants, it's going to undermine the conditions for success for something that is so costly and that involves so many resources, and probably would also involve a kind of shared national commitment to that. I think that he's going to disrupt things too much, even in a world where he decided that he would remain focused on one thing for long enough to see it through. I feel like I don't know. I'm just skeptical of that being achieved. But I mean, again, it's day by day right now.
And I'm just curious, how does the far right, for example, think of a competitor like China? Like there is a racial component to that, and one of the threats
Mhm.
is, well, Chinese are ahead. How do they see that? How do they compare that in terms of, especially with their space program and other achievements? How do they justify it, or how do they see China within their worldview?
Yeah, I think it varies, but a lot of particularly white nationalists see China as like as a nation of capable engineers but not innovators. And this is, I think, one of the things that they often do to try to preserve their vanity is suggest that there are other racial populations, and we should be skeptical of even this claim, that have especially high IQs, but they don't have the kind of romantic spirit required to do something self-sacrificing and great, or they don't have some sort of innate innovation capacity. Again, this is all, I think, totally bogus race science, but the idea is that Europeans and Americans have sort of the drive to do something great, like land on the moon, but everybody else, even if they have the smarts to do it, don't have that sort of inner hunger or spirit. Um, and then, yeah, there's also just a great deal of nationalistic fervor of seeing China as a competitor, and seeing this as a kind of struggle over global or dominance, essentially. And yeah, seeing the United States as in decline relative to China and the rest of the world, and wanting to use space travel as a way to claim that former greatness, and ultimately demonstrate, uh, if not white supremacy, then at least U.S. supremacy.
It's really interesting, and one of the things that struck me, there was a mention of that when there is a mention of Chinese innovation, it's like, oh, this is just copying, that they are just capable of copying, and
Yeah.
which again, I mean, coming from a background from Pakistan or Muslim background, so like I'm more familiar with the tropes when I see Islamophobia, for example. I was like, oh,
Mhm,
that
mhm.
like terrorism and things like that. So I'm more attuned to that, but I was not attuned to how often you hear when it's China is mentioned. If they do something, it's like, oh, probably it was copied, probably it was stolen, right? And so, and
Mhm.
that is a particular trope, like and like and so anyway, so that was really interesting to me, and this is something that you're also saying in terms of that, like then it gets framed in there why they would be ahead, but they don't have the innovation part.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, whiteness is associated with originality,
Right.
rather than imitation. Yeah, and I think it's again like just a way for them to try to explain away any other nation or group's achievements, at all costs. But yeah, I mean, I think it is something that they are worried about, and I think it's something that, as I suggested, like they really see the lack of crewed missions to say Mars as a kind of a sign of decline and decadence. I mean, some of them even suggest that even white people are no longer intelligent enough to achieve spaceflight anymore, or something like that. Like they're really worried about this, and I think it becomes more than the science or than anything else. It becomes a kind of a symbol of reclaimed pride, is what they see these imagined missions to be.
Well, Dr. Carroll, that was a fascinating conversation. It like went in many different directions, but I think your book is fascinating. I think it's timely right now. Uh, these are, I mean, in some ways, worrisome times. In Europe, I just yesterday I heard about, like, there is a mega instead of maga, so make Europe great again. And so there are these things coming in, but I think it's a lot of the people that I interact with, and people who watch this, they are space enthusiasts. They are sort of like for it, and I think it's good to know where some of these things are coming from, so that you have a broader perspective. And I think your book does that very well, including a lot of the science fiction. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.